All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Jeremy Dimick. I'm the Director of Collections and Curatorial at the Detroit Historical Society. So first of all, hello from Detroit. Our organization is celebrating our 100th anniversary, or I guess I should say our 102nd anniversary. But we keep saying that's our 100th. That's close enough. What's a couple of years after a century or so? But our organization was founded in 1921, and we started collecting artifacts related to the history of the city. Over those 102, 103 years, we've amassed a collection of about 250,000 objects, all related to Detroit and the kind of broadly southeastern Michigan region. The very first thing that was collected from that artifact collection was a piece of log that was about, 2-3 feet long, with a hole about the size of your fist drilled right through the middle. And you might think, like, well, why is that worth collecting? Why was that the first thing the museum took into its collection? And then that is because it was a piece of wooden water main that was actually state-of-the-art in the 1840s. Detroit was renowned for its water system in the 1840s, but it all ran through these tamarack logs that were tarred together. And it was pretty exciting in 1921 when they dug this up and donated it to the museum. And now, about 100 years later, every time there's a construction project in a new part of the city, they're constantly digging up these logs and offering them to the museum. And we've actually started turning them down. It's like, no, thank you. We don't want any more wooden water main anymore. But one of the most recent large acquisitions to our collection was this collection of material related to the Stroh Brewing Company. And that's what brings me to you today talking about this subject. We're going to get into this collection pretty heavily. Pretty much everything you see on the screen is part of this Stroh corporate collection that made its way to the museum in February 2022. But before we jump into that, I wanted to take a minute quickly here to talk about our organization. Quick commercial at the beginning, and then we'll get that out of the way and get into the meat of the presentation here. So our building, if you're not familiar with it, is the Detroit Historical Museum. We're right on Woodward between the DIA and Wayne State University. This building was built in 1951 on Detroit's 250th birthday, July 24th, 1951. It opened at the corner of Woodward and Kirby, and we're still there today. 10 years later, we opened our second museum, the Dawson Great Lakes Museum out on Belle Isle. This museum is dedicated to Detroit's maritime history. So, of course, Belle Isle is a pretty good place to have a maritime museum. The people who organized this building, thought there wasn't enough maritime presence at the main museum and decided to raise some money and build something dedicated to Detroit's maritime story because, the city is kind of literally and figuratively built by the river, and that's the name of the main exhibit at the Dawson there. Both of these are still open to the public, and of course, you can come and visit anytime. We'd be happy to see you. Here's a quick peek inside the main museum in Midtown Detroit. You can see our Gallery of Culture, our America's Motor City exhibit. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention our state, national, international award-winning exhibit about the events of July 1967. This is a really complex history that took a long time to develop this exhibit, and it was actually based on more than 500 oral histories that were collected just from everyday people who lived in the city, and then the narrative of this exhibit was kind of sculpted around those perspectives. So the exhibit's called Detroit 67 Perspectives. The museums today are very different than they were in 1951 and 1961 when they opened. But of course, the one thing that if you visited once, 30 years ago, or if you came over the weekend, you would have been the same. And that's the streets of old Detroit that are down in the lower level of the museum. These are just dark and scary enough where if you visit them as a kid, they stick in your mind and you will remember it forever. And people who haven't been to our place since they were in third grade, a lot of times say, oh yeah, I remember the streets down in the basement, the lower level, I should say. One thing that is new to the museum, just off of the streets of old Detroit, is an exhibit called Detroit's Brewing Heritage. And this is one of our newest. This opened just about a year ago. It's one of 19 temporary exhibits that we did over the course of last year. And while certain things are the same, we try to change it up all the time and do different exhibits, focus on different Detroit and southeastern Michigan stories. So everybody who comes through our building can see a bit of themselves on the walls and a bit of their family story. on the walls. But this is one of these temporary exhibits that is going to be running through the end of this year. It's the history of Detroit beer dating back before even French colonials showed up. All the way through kind of the local craft beer scene that has exploded in Michigan and really all over the country. It includes a bunch of material from a certain company that's going to be the focus of our time today. So with that, the commercial will be over, and we'll get into what we actually wanted to talk about. So there's lots of good histories of the Stroh company out there. There's a couple books that I'll mention at the end that cover a lot of the same ground that this presentation will cover, but the good thing about this presentation is that we have access to those artifacts that I mentioned before. So all of this artwork that you see on the screen, all of the artifacts you'll see on the screen are from this Stroh corporate collection that was collected over the last, 100 years and stored by the company and then eventually donated to the Historical Museum. It was cared for and carefully curated, but it certainly wasn't open to the public. It was in a private collection and not publicly available. But of course, this dovetails nicely into what we do as an organization, which is to tell these stories using three-dimensional artifacts and images and advertising and artwork and all kinds of things. Also, Stroh's is really a Detroit story worth telling, and that's our mission. We tell Detroit stories and why they matter. It's one of these iconic Detroit brands, kind of on level with, the car companies, the sports teams, Faygo, Better Made. Stroh is in that kind of stratosphere of legendary Detroit companies. And in fact, it looms so large, again, kind of figuratively and literally, that even the route of I-75 had to detour around it. And you can see the brewery with I-75 kind of bending around Stroh Brewery. Of course, famously, when I-75 went through Detroit, it cleared entire neighborhoods. They knocked down churches, they tore down houses, but the road went around Stroh Brewery. Also, typically, big companies don't tend to focus on their own history, which makes all of this material really interesting. Most companies are very forward-facing. They're worried about profits or the next quarter or what they can do. Most of them don't care about the past because the past can't really do anything for them. Stroh's was different in that way. They leaned very heavily on their company history and their advertising, and it wasn't just, kind of fluff. They were collecting this stuff behind the scenes because they thought it was important to preserve. The company was family owned for 150 years, and again, they always paid attention to their own history and used it in their marketing. I got my slides a little messed up there. Apologies. So, of course, Detroit beer and Stroh's specifically doesn't just come out of nowhere. It doesn't come out of a vacuum. It has to come from somewhere. And it's really formed as part of the human race's long obsession with beer, if you want to call it that. So some very quick background here at the top. Beer itself is about 6,000 years old. And by the time we start writing or have any kind of systematic writing form, so even on cuneiform tablets, they're already keeping track of beer sales and where beer is going. You can see this in the earliest written documents, quote unquote, that we have. Of course, it wasn't the kind of beer that you crack the top and pour into a glass today, but it was beer in the sense that it was made from these four key ingredients. So water, grain, yeast, and hops. The Mayflower had beer on it coming across the Atlantic Ocean. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington had breweries on their properties. So beer's been around for a long time, but our Detroit beer story really starts in 1706. And that is when the man, the myth, the legend, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, on the left there, invites a guy named Joseph Parent to move to Fort Pontchartrain on the Straits between Lake Huron and Lake Erie. Parent is what was referred to then as a mechanic, quote unquote. But in those days, in the 1700s, a mechanic was really somebody who could work with iron. So that was his main job. He was this jack of all trades that was very useful in a place like Detroit because as far as the French were concerned, Detroit is on the absolute edge of the map. If you sent a letter from Detroit to France in the early 1700s, you might get a reply in 3 years. So having a guy who can do things and fix things and knows things is a very important guy to have around. One of the things that Joseph Parent could do, aside from ironworking, and he knew a little bit of chemistry as well, was he could brew beer. And it wasn't, again, the kind of beer you would have today, but he knew that, as most people did, you know, running your water through some kind of fermentation process or adding a couple drops of brandy or whiskey to your water was really the best way to skirt around these waterborne diseases that were extremely prevalent at the time. So dysentery, cholera, that sort of thing. You should not trust the water in 1700s Detroit, and they didn't. So Parent was really important and started brewing what he called a small beer, which was mostly for business, you could say, and not so much for pleasure. But of course, if you drank enough of it, it could probably keep a party going if you needed it to. So we're going to jump forward to 1853. And this is a map of Detroit in that year, 1853. It's a city of about 20,000 people at this point. And you'll notice all the dots on these screens are breweries. So already in 1853, Detroit had 17 breweries, which, if you do the math, works out to one for about every 1,200 people in the city. And Detroit can support that many breweries with that few people because territory at this point is really measured in blocks. Most of these outfits were making really small batches of beer and delivering to their friends and neighbors kind of in the immediate vicinity. They're generally these like storefront operations as opposed to the big breweries that we're used to seeing at the turn of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And at this point, it's really important to remember who is brewing the beer really dictates what kind of beer is being brewed. So people from the British Isles, they tend to prefer ales and porters and stouts, and Germans, of course, brew pilsners and lagers. This growing German population in the 1840s and 50s in Detroit really creates this demand for German-style beers. And these are the companies that really grow into the behemoths that dominate the 20th century market. So we're talking Goebel, we're talking Schmidt, we're talking Mann, Voigt, and of course, Stroh's. German-style beer, pilsners and lagers, become so popular that those styles kind of become synonymous with beer itself for a while. And of course, Stroh is one of those German brewers. So this is Detroit in 1850, just a couple years later. Again, 20,000 people. Bernard Stroh, who is in the bottom right-hand corner there, he comes to Detroit in 1850, so this is likely what he would have seen when he was walking around town. According to company lore, he was actually on his way to Chicago. He had worked for a couple years after coming over from Kern, Germany in Pennsylvania, and got on a boat, went across Lake Erie, stopped in Detroit while the boat was taking on fuel, and walked around for a little while, and he liked it, and so he decided to stay. He brought with him kind of this long established family brewing tradition from his hometown. So he sets up a small brewing operation, again, really a storefront, kind of small scale operation on Catherine Street near Hastings. Which is labeled as S1 there. If you can see a bit of modern Detroit there, Campus Martius in the center, the Detroit River to center yourself down at the bottom, and of course Grand Circus Park up there. This whole area that's highlighted in yellow is this German enclave. Like I mentioned, Detroit's exploding with German immigration in the 1840s and 50s. Stroh knows he's going to be brewing for these German immigrants, so he smartly sets up shop inside this German neighborhood. After a decade of brewing at this place on Catherine Street, he knew a bigger brewery was going to be needed. So he buys some land on Gratiot, just about a stone's throw from where he initially started. He starts building there in 1864, and he starts brewing at this second location marked as Stroh 2 there by 1867. This is what that brewery ends up looking like. This is the Stroh family home in the foreground and the brewery kind of in the background. The front of that building says Brewery of B. Stroh, which would date the photo to sometime in the late 1760s. I'm sorry, 1860s, because he renamed it the Lion Brewery in 1875. It's Italianate in style. It's one of the taller buildings in town. It has these two 12-foot long lions on either corner of the brewery, and I'll walk over here at my own hazard. And you can see one of them in the foreground here. And these are actually carved by Julius Melchers, who was also new to Detroit and did, if you're familiar with public art in Detroit, Melchers is all over the place. But these lions, of course, figure very heavily into Stroh's advertising and Stroh history because they are the municipal symbol, according to company legend, of Köln, Germany, where Stroh comes from. So, which is why when you go and buy a Stroh at Meijer this weekend, there's still a lion on it because of this original lion brewery. This is Gratiot. Downtown Detroit is behind us. Kind of that way is on the way up to Port Huron if you follow it till the end of the road. But the brewery was built in the 1870s when Stroh was growing, but they certainly weren't the biggest beer producer in town. By sales volume in this period, they were actually fourth. Behind Goebel, behind Kling, and Voigt was really the top dog in Detroit in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. But Stroh was on the rise. So this is a different angle, and it's actually a little bit later in time. This would place this rendering sometime in the 1880s, right before the turn of the 20th century. Again, you can see those lions on either side of the building there. It actually brings up the first three-dimensional object from this collection I wanted to show you, and it's this piece right here, which doesn't look like much, but I'll tell you all about it. This is the keystone from one of these arches on the ground floor of that Lion Brewery. We don't know exactly which one it was, but you'd have to imagine that if it says the company name and it says the year that construction started on the building, it was probably over one of the more prominent arches. So we're thinking, and I haven't been able to figure it out quite yet, that it's, you know, maybe one of these in the center or maybe this one over the main entrance off of Gratiot there. Yeah, and it says Bistro 1864 on there. This object has a really fascinating story that illustrates a lot of what I talked about before, just the company having this really rich sense of its own history right from the beginning. So by 1935, this original Lion Brewery on the left now looked like this. So this is Gratiot, downtown Detroit to the left, Port Huron up to your right. Stroh's left one floor of this original Lion Brewery as a storehouse for grain and hops and anything they needed to store. The modern brewery that we're going to talk about in just a second is in the background, and you can see it back behind those buildings. At this point, that keystone is still there, somewhere in the building. Again, we don't know exactly where, but we know it's still there. By 1936, so the very next year, Stroh tore the rest of that storehouse down. The rest of that old Lion Brewery, they tore it down to build a modern stockhouse right in its place on the same footprint. During the demolition, crews actually saved that keystone and implanted it, built it into the wall of the new stockhouse, which you can see up there in that blue rectangle. And I'll blow that up here so you can see it up close. But it says original keystone 1864, Stroh Brewery Company 1935. And you can actually see the inscription on there that obviously suffered a little bit of weathering between 1930, well, the roughly 1950s when that picture was taken and it being donated to the museum in 2022. But at least it was saved, which is a really great piece, and really, you know, the whole history of the company is kind of wrapped up in this one object, which is pretty neat. But back to our story. So by the 1890s, they're shipping beer as far as New England. Their operation's really growing. They're ramping up their marketing in really significant ways as well to expand their reach all over the country. One of the ways they did this was by creating an exhibit at arguably the most famous World's Fair in history, the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Our collection includes a handful of interesting objects related to this fair. And first and foremost is this bottle right here. So the bottle is interesting for a handful of reasons. First of all, it has a square label on it, which of course Stroh is very well known for having that oval shaped label that occupied their bottles for most of the 20th century. It's actually the first label that Stroh ever used. Before that, they just had raised letters on glass bottles that said Stroh Brewery Company, Detroit, Michigan. So the label is interesting. It has a special label up above, which is blue, and I'm not sure if you can read the text, but I'll read it for you. It says, Highest Award and Medal, World's Fair, 1893. And of course, if you know a bit about beer and a bit about beer history, you know that Pabst supposedly won their famous blue ribbon at the 1893 World's Fair as well. That's why they're called Pabst Blue Ribbon. So what gives? Well, according to Stroh Company files, they say, quote, there was plenty of medals to go around, end quote. And if you read a little further into the record, it appears that you basically got a medal if you were an exhibitor. So it's like a participation trophy, more or less. Which is interesting. But we also have a picture of the medal themselves. I'm sorry, a picture here, and we have the actual medal that they won, their highest award and medal from the 1893 World's Fair, a picture of Christopher Columbus on the medal there. We also have an image of what their display looked like at this fair. And it's completely made out of kegs and out of bottles and crates of beer, which must have been an interesting thing to see. We also have in the collection one of these souvenirs that if you visited this exhibit at the World's Fair, you would walk away with one of these. It says Stroh Beer, Detroit, USA. And these are, even though they literally gave out hundreds of thousands of these to people who visited the fair, these are becoming increasingly rare because they're very breakable. And of course, they were ephemeral. You know, you might have got one at the fair and then just thrown it away when you got home, because what do I need this for? I probably got a bunch of stuff at the fair. So these are turning into collector's items. But with that, I've been talking a little while, so I wanted to play you one of these commercials that we got as part of the collection as well. We received boxes and boxes and boxes of film, of videotape, and all kinds of other things we've been digitizing, making publicly available, and putting it up. A lot of this material you can actually see on the museum's YouTube page. So as long as I did it right, we should be able to hear as well as see this commercial, and I fingers crossed we can, but here we go.
I'd sure like another Stroh's.
Oh, wait. Alex, 2 cold Strohs.
Where do you see this?
Just open the refrigerator. Just open one bottle. Just open the other. Now he's pouring yours. Now he's pouring mine. Alex, you better be drinking your water.
Stroh's and Stroh Light for great taste and good times.
I could use another fire-brewed Stroh's. Hey, there are only 4 Stroh's left.
Alex, we're out of Stroh's. Just opened the car door. He just closed it. He just fastened his seatbelt. Alex, you better be taking your own car.
Stroh's and Stroh Light, fire brewed for smoother taste.
So we have a few of those peppered through the presentation. We'll take a break every now and then and watch another commercial, because those are a lot of fun. And they, I mean, they're really funny, all of them. And they, boy, one gets stuck in your head in particular. But anyway, before our break, we were talking about Stroh's getting better and better at promoting themselves. And aside from the World's Fair, they did everything they could to get their name out there. They built floats, put them in parades. They'd sponsor baseball teams. And they had gotten so good at promoting themselves that by January 1902, they were the largest brewery by barrel volume in the city. And they were making about 300,000 barrels of beer a year. They were undoubtedly helped by the fact that this German population I mentioned before is still booming. What started in the 1840s continued all the way through until about the turn of the 20th century. And not just the German population, Detroit across the board was bursting at the seams. Every decade between 1840 and 1930, the Detroit population doubles every decade. So by 1910, a full 20% of the city's 500,000 people came directly and were born in countries that have kind of an affinity for beer. So you think of Germany and the British Isles, again, kind of chief among them. So Julius Stroh, who is now the company president, he's Bernard's son, he knew that this increased demand would just keep growing, and it would eventually outpace their ability to produce it. 300,000 barrels was about the limit of what they could do at that old Lion brewery that we spent some time talking about. So he sends their brewmaster, this guy on the screen now, a guy named Otto Rosenbusch, to tour Europe and basically pick up tips and tricks on what all the big European breweries are doing, and bring it back to the US, and then they'll put it all together and build a new building based on what they find out in Europe. So when Rosenbusch was touring a brewery in Bohemia, he observes this brewing process that involved small copper kettles that were heated by direct fire. And by this point, about the turn of the 20th century, almost any brewery of, or all breweries of any size, I should say, abandoned this method of brewing beer. It was seen as kind of old-fashioned, it was out of date, and most people used steam instead of a direct flame to create their beer. It's more economic, you have more control, you can really dial it in and get the exact temperature you need. But Rosenbusch loved the taste, and he brought this back to Stroh and convinced him that they could do this on a large scale in America. And based on this recommendation, Stroh actually hires this German company to create and build these fire brew kettles, 6 fire brewed copper kettles at their brand new 8-story brewery in downtown Detroit. This is actually the original drawing, so it's kind of ground zero for Stroh's. This is, what allows them to have that trademark fire brewed taste that they tout, all the way through the history of the company, and that's something they really lean on to set themselves apart from other breweries. Really interesting piece, and really cool that it's in the original German language too, so it's directly from those German engineers' pens to our collection, which is pretty neat. So while they were employing this really kind of outmoded brewing technique, their new brewery was state-of-the-art for 1912 when they started building it. And here it is with the shorter kind of administrative building right in front of it. They are actually located on Elizabeth Street, which is one street removed from Gratiot. You can see right in the center of this photo, Stroh Lion Brewery right here, which is the building we were talking about, and the big X there is the brand new brewery and administrative building that are on the right. The first floor brewing hall was really the showpiece that was worthy of the _1 brewer in town. So here it is in black and white. You can see those huge copper kettles, but everything is trimmed out in this iridescent brown and green Pewabic tile, kind of as far as the eye can see. You can see these hop vines that are painted on the ceiling, and it was really, a statement that they were they were Detroit's #1 brewer, and they were a serious operation. It even had, if you look down the far end of that picture on the right, you can see a stained glass window, which is represented in our collection as well. It's about 6 feet tall, and that's the Stroh family crest right in the middle there. Here's a color image of the brew house from a postcard in the 1970s. You can actually see those colors as well as some of the tile in the upper right and the doors off of these kettles. Yeah, really, really something to behold, something they were very proud of and used a lot in their marketing. Interesting story about these kettles. When the Detroit brewery closed in the 1980s, they were actually sold off, and a couple of them went to Kalamazoo and are used to brew Bell's beer to this day. So if you buy Bell's beer and drink that, you're drinking it out of a Stroh brew kettle. So Stroh's had made a huge, and I mean huge, outlay for their new facility. Starting in 1912, they started building this, and they finished in 1914, and were finally able to brew some beer. And this just happens to be about 3 years ahead of when Michigan adopts Prohibition. And Michigan was the first state to adopt Prohibition in 1917, even before national Prohibition was enacted in 1919. And so while other Detroit brewers just shut down instead of trying to figure out a way to manage through and stay open through Prohibition, Stroh's was forced to stay open because they had to recoup all of this money that they laid out for their brand new brew house. So right up until the legislation for national prohibition passed, beer brewers thought they were actually going to be exempt. But feeling the kind of winds of change leading up to Prohibition, they started tweaking their product to be a little bit more family friendly. I love this ad on the left. In every Puritan home, beer was the favorite beverage. And then on the label to the right, you can see it's bottled, specially bottled for family use, Stroh's beer. But they started positioning beer as kind of a temperance drink unto itself. So temperance kind of gets confused with prohibition, but temperance is really the moderation of alcohol intake as opposed to prohibition, which is the outright banishment of it. Brewers thought that a 4% alcohol beer or a 5% alcohol beer was kind of this logical alternative to a bottle of whiskey, for example. So they thought this would help with temperance, with moderation. But of course, when the legislation is rolled out, the only beer allowable by law was a 0.5% alcohol beer. So Stroh's had to pivot, and they had to pivot very quickly. They survived by doing a number of things. So of course, they stopped brewing Stroh's Bohemian beer, and they started brewing Stroh's Bohemian Lager, because lager is not the same as beer. And they brewed it at the 0.5% that was allowable by law, so half a percentage of alcohol content. The brewing process was pretty much the same as before Prohibition, but at the end, they actually ran the 4% alcohol beer through this process they call de-alcoholization. And what it did is it heated up the beer to a point where it boiled most of the alcohol off. But what it also did is scorch the heck out of it. And so it gave the beer a terrible taste, an extremely bitter taste. And to get around this, they realized that if they served it cold, it would actually be palatable and you could drink it. And so this is when you see that phrase, ice cold beer, or serve ice cold, creep into kind of the beer lexicon, because the temperature was masking the terrible taste. So you start to see this beer served at 32, 29 degrees, where previously it had been served at 50 degrees. They also renamed themselves the Stroh Products Company, and they started making a myriad of kind of different brands. The most prominent out of this lot is probably Stroh's Alaska Ice Cream. They had changed the name a couple times, but the ice cream proved so popular that it's still around today. You can go and buy Stroh's Imperial ice cream, so the name's a little bit different, but Stroh's ice cream is still around. But they also made a variety of soft drinks to try and keep the ship afloat. They made a couple of kinds of ginger ale. They made a mate cola. They made orange soda. They made club soda. So it's interesting, they kept making drink mixers, but they were not making drinks. You got to find your own. But my favorite out of this has to be this Stroh's malt syrup. And malt syrup is essentially unfermented brewery water. It's like the first step of the brewing process. And nominally, this is sold to be used in baking, but you'll notice it's a 1-gallon can, so it's basically a paint can full of this stuff, and most recipes of the day would call for 1 ounce or 2 ounces per dozen of cookies. So you would have to be making a lot of cookies to need a gallon worth of malt syrup. So it was a poorly guarded secret that most people were using this for brewing beer at home. And while selling beer is illegal, home brewing was not. But what was illegal was kind of creating these kits and pulling them all together and selling people homebrew kits. So you had to go out on your own and buy an ingredient from here, buy an ingredient from here, buy an ingredient from here, and you could get around the prohibition. Stroh's really told this line by printing a warning on their cans, and this cracks me up every time I see it. It says, "Warning, not to be used for making alcoholic or intoxicating beverages." So they even sold, a few years later, a hop-flavored malt syrup, which really makes you think like, gee, I wonder what that is actually being used for. And Stroh's wasn't the only one doing this. Budweiser actually has a famous ad from this period, which is a grocer actually winking right at the customer. It's like, Budweiser malt, we know what you're using it for. So as the only outfit brewing beer, or near beer, I should say, in Detroit, Stroh's had this really distinct advantage once Prohibition was actually repealed in 1933. All they had to do was reroute the beer from that de-alcoholizer to the bottling plant, and they were off and running. In fact, while other brewers were just starting to ramp up, Stroh's served 60,000 bottles of Stroh's Bohemian Lager to this American Legion convention that was in Detroit. And there you have Bernard Stroh, who's the mustachioed gentleman there, pouring a beer to Frederick Alger, who was the local leader of the repeal movement. But it might be time for another commercial break. I'll turn up the volume as far as I can, and away we go.
Son, son, I've been meaning to have a little talk with you. Huh? Would you turn that thing down?
What do you want to talk about, Pop?
Well, look, you're not a kid anymore, you know what I mean, huh?
Oh, please, Pop.
Oh, come on, son. I can still remember the day my father walked in just like this.
Oh, no, Pop.
All right, I'm gonna be straightforward. When you go out with your friends, do you ever drink beer?
Pop,
Come
please.
on, son, be honest with me. Do you drink beer?
Of course I drink beer, Pop. I'm 29 years old.
Okay. I just want to know that you're drinking good beer.
I drink good beer.
That's what you say. Oh. If I knew you were drinking Stroh's, I'd know you were drinking good beer.
What do you think? You're the only one in the world who knows what good beer is? Well, it just so happens. Pop, listen to me. I drink Stroh's. Honest.
Son, your mother and I, we only want what's best for you.
Oh.
So even with Prohibition repealed, Stroh's wasn't quite out of the woods yet. Just as the beer supply was recovering from Prohibition, there were a couple of grain shortages related to the Dust Bowl, which really impacted the grain supply. And then right on the heels of that, World War II rationed grain production. And this forced a lot of brewers to a crossroad. They could either decide to make less beer with the amount of grain that was available, or make weaker beer and still produce as much as they wanted. So a lot of companies decided to make weaker beer. Stroh's decided to make less beer. And while this really preserved their reputation kind of in the immediate post-war period, it actually became a liability later. And it became a liability because over the last 30 years, at the beginning of the 20th century, beer drinkers had really gotten used to a lighter tasting, really less flavorful beer. By the 1950s, people hadn't had quote-unquote real beer in about 30 years, since before Prohibition. So the fact that Stroh's was essentially serving the same thing they were serving during World War I actually meant that it had a much heavier, much more bitter taste by comparison. You can see this ad from Stroh Detroit competitor Goebel saying, "Have you tried Goebel beer lately? It's mellowized." And you can see these changing consumer tastes in Stroh's post-World War II production numbers. They made 90,000 barrels in 1947 and only made 400,000 barrels in 1950. Goebel, coincidentally, was one of the brewers that shut down during Prohibition. So when they reopened, they tweaked their taste. During these grain shortages, they weakened it again, and now all of a sudden they have this more modern but weaker tasting beer. So Stroh's all of a sudden is in third place behind Goebel and Pfeiffer, both of who shut down during Prohibition. And they were in third place for the first time in almost a century, in 80 years. So instead, Stroh decided it was easier to tweak their formula than to tweak changing consumer tastes. And they made the beer lighter, and they debuted this kind of on the nose but nonetheless effective marketing slogan, "You like Stroh's beer, it's lighter," in 1951. And soon they were back on top. By 1956, they had sold almost 3 million barrels, which is a record high. So times were good again. That is until spring 1958, when a strike shut down beer production for 45 days. And while this was really damaging in the short term, beer historians and historians kind of broadly really point to this moment as the time when national brewers were able to get a foothold in Detroit. You could always buy Budweiser or Pabst, for example, in the city, but they never really had the hold they had in other cities because the Detroit market with Goebel and Stroh and Pfeiffer was so strong. But after the strike, it took all of these Detroit brewers about 10 years, almost a decade, to recoup the sales they lost and kind of build that customer base back up and really get back to where they were before the strike. So even though it only lasted for 45 days, the effect of it took about a decade to rectify. Stroh's eventually recovered, but their neighbor across Gratiot Avenue, so you can see Stroh's on the left-hand side, and there's Goebel right across Gratiot, was headed in the opposite direction. Goebel had tried to expand and kind of failed on the West Coast. and Stroh's buys Goebel in 1964. And this acquisition was really smart. It was considered a great move for the company in the 60s, but it was really the beginning of kind of this industry arms race, if you want to call it that, that forced the company into making these larger and larger financial gambles just to stay afloat. We're going to skip forward a little bit here, but heading into the 1970s, you can see they were in a very good position and setting production records just about every couple of years. So 1970, 72, 75. By 1976, they're up past 6 million barrels of beer. But that was about as far as they could, pardon me, about as far as they could go as a regional brewer in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They kind of expanded out into the Great Lakes region, but not really much beyond that. They knew they couldn't really create more beer drinkers. They just had to convert more beer drinkers to the Stroh product. And so one of the ways they did that is by rolling out some new products. The newest beer product and kind of beer fad in the late 1970s, early 1980s was light beer, diet beer as it was called at first. Miller paved the way with their Miller Lite in 1975, and it's interesting to note that when they launched Miller Lite, they were actually the 5th largest brewer in the country. Stroh's was a little late to the party. They rolled out Stroh Lite in 1979, and this ad from the Free Press, which is hard to read on the screen, but I'll read it for you here, tells you one of the reasons they waited so long to do it. So this ad says, quote, "As near as we can tell, the Stroh family has been brewing since 1775. And with all due modesty, we think we've made quite the name for ourselves with regular beer. So the logical question is, why are we putting all that on the line for the dubious distinction of being the last major brewer in the country to come out with a light beer? It's simple. We found a way to make a light beer good enough to bear our name. We call it Stroh Light," end quote. But unfortunately, Stroh Light never really caught on, not like Miller Lite did anyway. And it didn't compete with Miller Lite or even Bud Light that came out a couple years later, 1982, which I was surprised to learn that it was that late. So with Stroh Light not necessarily being the hit they thought it would, it was okay, it was serviceable, but it didn't really change the game at all. In 1982, they rolled out this beer called Stroh Signature in the super premium category. So it came with this gold foil on top. It would come in wooden crates, and they launched this kind of most interesting man in the universe marketing campaign with this guy who's scuba diving and jumping off cliffs and doing all kinds of exciting things. But this super premium category went away with the rise of import beers, really before it could be of any real service to Stroh's. And so Stroh Signature wasn't necessarily the game changer they had hoped it would be either. And with Anheuser-Busch and Miller like steadily chipping away all the time at all of these remaining regional brewers' customer base, Stroh's couldn't keep on like everything was fine. So they had tried new products to get more beer drinkers, Light and Signature. Now they tried something different. They started to grow by acquisition. And they went after New York's Schaefer beer in 1981. The acquisition gave Stroh's Schaefer's distribution network on the East Coast, but it also gave Stroh's this brand new brewery in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is kind of the direct opposite of everything the Detroit brewery was. This brewery was suburban. It was kind of sprawling. It's all almost on one level. There's plenty of room to expand all over the place. It has access to freeways and rail and everything you need in a new brewery. This was actually the star of the acquisition, this Allentown brewery. At the time of the merger, Stroh's was the 7th largest brewer in the country by sales. And to give you an idea of how far back they were, even at 7, they were making about 7 million barrels a year, and Anheuser-Busch up on top was making about 50 million barrels a year. Adding Schaefer's roughly 4 million barrels didn't even get Stroh into 6th place nationally. So a couple years later, they then buy the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company out of Milwaukee. The beer that made Milwaukee famous is now a Detroit product. So after this acquisition in 1982, Stroh's is now the 4th largest brewer in the country. And it vaulted them from 7th to 3rd, and it was an acquisition that the Wall Street Journal actually called a goldfish swallowing a whale because Stroh was so much smaller than Schlitz. And after the Schlitz deal, they actually installed fire brew kettles in Allentown and in Los Angeles. So you can start to kind of see the handwriting on the wall for the flagship Detroit brewery. This deal actually ends a couple of crazy years for the company if you take a step back and look at it. So in 1980, the beginning of the decade, they had one brewery, they could make 7 million barrels of beer, and they had 3 brands. They had Stroh, they had Stroh Light, and they had Stroh Signature. 2 years later, they were a 7 brewery operation that could produce 22 million barrels of beer a year with 19 different brands serving a national market. Just 2 years, from 1980 to 1982. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can see this is kind of the peak for the company. About 1985, they produced 24 million barrels that year, which was an all-time high. They also have some great marketing, so I wanted to show you one of my favorites from this 1980s period here.
Out on the town, buying around, pizzas disappear. Now you're talking Friday night, now you're talking beer. Now you're talking good times, and Stroh's is smoking here.
Stroh Light, smooth, refreshing, less filling.
Now you're talking Stroh's, now you're talking beer. Now you're talking good times, and Stroh's is smoking here.
Boy, and that one gets stuck in your head. I love that one because those guys are so busy. It's like it's just, after work on a Friday, but they're playing pool, they're eating pizza, they're watching a boxing match. It's like they got all kinds of stuff going on. But that's a good one. But after 1985, the decline was fairly rapid. So Stroh's had taken on about $500 million worth of debt from that Schlitz deal at a very, very bad time. Kind of sales across the market were flat. And it's right in time for a price war between Anheuser-Busch and Miller that really cut into profits. So they had a hard decision to make. They soon realized they didn't need all 7 of their breweries, and you can probably see where this is going. Detroit was their most expensive plant because it's landlocked by Gratiot Avenue and freeways, mostly on all sides. It's also the oldest, and it's also the most urban, which is all expensive things for a brewery. And now with the ability to fire brew in a couple different places in Allentown and in Los Angeles, the brewery was, essentially a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. It's really this relic from a time when proximity to your customers was more important than kind of geographical flexibility. Bernard Stroh, for example, starts delivering beer barrels to people in wheelbarrows, and then eventually, gets enough money to buy a horse and wagon. So you have to be pretty close to your customers. By the almost turn of the 21st century, you don't necessarily need that anymore. The Peter Stroh, who is the chairman of the company in the 1980s, says this about the closing of the Detroit plant. He says, quote, "I want to emphasize strongly that our need to close the plant is not a Detroit problem, a union problem, a power problem, a workers' compensation problem, or a utilities problem. It's just a problem of a plant that is very, very old, geographically constricted, and no longer competitive with the modern facilities which so dominate our industry today," end quote. So the last working day at the Detroit plant was May 31st, 1985, and then the complex was demolished the next spring. Even with the Detroit plant closed, Stroh wasn't quite done yet. They changed their look again in 1989, going to this blue for regular Strohs and the silver for Stroh Light. That same year, 1989, it looked like they were going to be acquired by Coors, a deal that actually fell through in the 11th hour. Now Stroh's was going to have to make it on their own. They were going to sink or swim on their own. Their final gamble was in 1996. They bought the Heilemann Brewing Company out of Wisconsin, and with it, they bought all of Heilemann's brands. Old Style might be the most familiar. So it didn't move them out of that number 3 position. It didn't move them past Miller or past Anheuser-Busch, but it was considered a good move. Heilemann was number 4. And they thought that the new kind of Stroh-Heilemann combination would put them in a good position going forward. It also gave Stroh's this footprint in the American Northwest, which was extremely important because Heilemann had a couple brands out there. It was extremely important because then they could ship beer to Asia, which was one place that the beer market was actually growing, kind of by leaps and bounds. So it was this strategic arrangement as well. But ultimately, kind of competition was too fierce. There's another price war in the late 1990s, which made this deal increasingly unprofitable. So Stroh's eventually sold to Pabst and Miller in April 1999, just 1 year shy of their 150th birthday. So it begs the question, what killed Stroh's? It would be easy to say it was mismanagement or one like kind of big critical error, but experts say it was something a little more boring. Economies of scale and kind of changing consumer tastes. Historically, brewers expanded by two methods. They expanded organically or they expanded by acquisition. Budweiser, as an example, really grew organically. They would build a brewery in a market that they wanted to tap into, put Budweiser up for sale against everything else in that market. And people liked Budweiser and Bud Light so much, eventually it caught on and crowded out these more regional, local brewers. Stroh chose to try to grow by acquisition. So you can see them buying these brands, but instead of replacing Schaefer or Schlitz or Heilemann brands with Stroh and taking those other brands off the market, they left them there and assumed basically that they would be buying those companies' customers as well. It didn't quite work out that way, and it left them brewing about 30 different beers. And in short, it's really expensive to brew 30 different beers, especially when Anheuser-Busch was brewing Budweiser, Bud Light, Busch, Busch Light, maybe a handful of others. It's just a way cheaper model to brew fewer brands. And interestingly, this fight to go national, Stroh's kept tweaking their taste over and over and over again to make their beer kind of as palatable as possible to the widest amount of people. The end result is that a Bud Light, a Miller Lite, and a Stroh's Light were nearly kind of interchangeable taste-wise. So while people were certainly sad when the Detroit brewery changed, there was an easy replacement that people found pretty quickly. And ironically, they get rid of the thing that set them apart in the first place, which was that different taste from the fire brewing. Kind of this homogeneous taste across all beer, or macro breweries, if you want to call it that, is what gives rise to the craft beer movement and the micro beer kind of obsession that booms in the late 80s, early 90s, and really took off after the turn of the 20th century. It's interesting, there's like this funneling effect from the late 1800s where there's all these beers funneled down to a couple big producers and then comes back out with this craft beer explosion. So if this presentation has made you thirsty, believe it or not, you can still go to your local grocery store and buy a Stroh's, assuming it's one of the brands they carry. It's not everywhere, but I do know Meijer stores in Michigan carry Stroh's. It's in this circa 1989 packaging that you can see here. In 2016, Pabst teamed up with this outfit called Brew Detroit, which is a contract brewery within the city limits. And they brewed the original Stroh's Bohemian Lager for a fair amount of time, for a couple years. And so for the first time since 1986, Stroh's was actually being brewed in Detroit. I think now it is brewed elsewhere. It's brewed in a Pabst facility in Milwaukee, and it's kind of sad to read a Stroh's can, and it says Stroh Brewing Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin on it, but that's where we're at now. Pabst owns the brand, and they never really did away with it. They just kind of peeled way back on pushing it. So when it was reintroduced in 2016, it made a big splash, but I think it's kind of fallen off again. I will show you one last commercial here to take us out.
Why, I said just do it again before I lose it.
Trying to rush, you can't top a good thing. What?
You can't top a good thing when it's made the right way. That's why smooth and mellow Stroh's is still fire brewed today. From one beer lover to another Stroh's beer. From one beer lover to another Stroh's.
That is sensational.
We'll play that back.
All right. Well, if you want more on this topic, I'd recommend a couple different sources. There is a podcast called Untold Detroit. It just so happens to be produced by the Detroit Historical Society. That's not why I recommend it, but I recommend it because it's a good podcast. It actually interviews experts on the subject and covers all beer in the city from the early colonial days all the way up through the present. It talks to key people from key companies, and it's just a very good Detroit beer broadly, not just Stroh's history. I would also recommend these two books. One is called Brewed in Detroit, Breweries and Beer Since 1830. That's by Peter Bloom, who is actually the gentleman who came up with the recipe for Stroh's Light and for Stroh's Signature. So he's a very knowledgeable person kind of from the inside and tells a story of Stroh's and all the other Detroit breweries since about 1830. But this book was written in the 1980s, and so it's a bit out of date. Detroit Beer, over on the right there, is a more kind of contemporary book. It came out, maybe 5-6 years ago now, and it kind of brings the story current, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Available at your local library. Steve Johnson is the author of that book. And with that, we're out. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate you having me out.